Tim, there's one thing, that's one elephant in the room that we just have to get out of the way before we begin. Is that okay?
One elephant? All right. Okay. Assuming that there's one elephant in the room, what is it?
Let's address this term, manifesto, straight on. And the idea that manifesto it's not a bad word.
It sounds like you're trying to convince me because it kind of sounds, it still has kind of a negative ring to me.
Okay, well, I had the same gut response as well.
Okay, but you're bringing this up because that's what we're going to talk about today with our guest, right?
Yeah, yes, it is. And I want to let listeners know, actually, most of the listeners in the U.S. who have the same bias that you and I do, that this word manifesto is something bad, that really manifesto is very simply and just this: a public declaration of policy and aims. And it's not this crazy political communist rant, okay?
Okay. Actually, I'm glad that you mentioned that because I had that same peculiar thought when I read Michael's title. This idea of the manifesto to me as an American was that like this paper would be some sort of communist rant. Okay, but it's not. It's just not, because that's not what a manifesto is. So fortunately, only about 50% of our listeners are in the U.S. and the rest are probably have a great grounding in what a manifesto really is. So it probably doesn't even affect them.
Yeah, they're probably going, why are you guys even talking about this?
Exactly.
Why are you bringing this up? Well, it's because we're American and us stupid Americans, kind of do that.
Yeah.
But let's get going, and let me say that our guest today is Michael Hallsworth. He is the managing director of the Behavioural Insights Team for the Americas. We've been chatting with Michael since 2018, when we first asked him about his role in the development of such great models as Mindscape and East.
Ooh, East. I'm so glad you mentioned that. One of my favorite models. Absolutely one of my favorites.
Yeah, and by the way, East and Mindscape are not manifestos.
Okay.
They're models. And we use them as practitioners.
Right.
And speaking of putting into practice, Michael co-authored one of our favorite books on the application of behavioral science with Elspeth Kirkman, a book called Behavioural Insights. And we strongly, strongly recommend this book to listeners who are trying to build a behavioral science practice. Anyway, Michael's always had great thoughts to share with us and with the world, and we appreciate that significantly.
Oh, God, isn't that the truth? Michael was one of our 3 special guests that we had at the 100th episode celebration in Philadelphia back in December 2019. God, can you imagine? Like just a few months before the world shut down with the pandemic, we were in Philadelphia celebrating our 100th episode. It's kind of amazing.
Oh my gosh. Getting to 100 episodes seems like such ancient history now. What are we at? 300 plus?
We're closing
How come we didn't celebrate 200 and 300 that same way that we celebrated 100?
Can you say pandemic?
Oh, pandemic. There you go. I forgot.
Okay, but more than just celebrating with behavioral grooves, Michael has been on the forefront of thought leadership and scholarship in behavioral science for many years. He earned his PhD from Imperial College in London in behavioral economics and has spent most of his career either working in public policy or on corporate applications with governments and organizations around the world.
And back to this manifesto, Michael has recently published this paper called A Manifesto for Applying Behavioral Science, and it's about the future of the still emerging, but now kind of established field that we call behavioral science. And in it, he outlines 10 proposals to get researchers and practitioners talking about how we can keep the fantastic new field on the right path. And welcome to Behavioral Grooves. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. And we hope that right now you sit back with a full glass of manifesto and enjoy our conversation with Michael Hallsworth. Michael Hallsworth, welcome to Behavioral Grooves again.
It's a pleasure to be back with you. Thanks.
It's great. We are here with Michael Hallsworth, a friend and compatriot in troubadour in the world of behavioral science, leading BIT, and we're here to discuss a paper that he's going to publish shortly, and it's called a manifesto for applying behavioral science. So how about if we just start with, Michael, why do we need a manifesto? Why is there a need for a manifesto at this point?
Yeah, sure. And I realized that actually quite far down the road that the word manifesto in the US has slightly different connotations. Like in the UK, it's just a standard thing that sets out what you're going to do and what you kind of believe in and your principles and so on. And I think in the US it has more connotations around like the Communist Manifesto, for example, which does that stuff, but it's more of a past kind of associated with a particular perspective. So to clear that up, this is meant to be the idea is a set of principles, and it's a statement about what should be important for the future of applied behavioral science. That's what we're getting at with that term, manifesto. And I think where I'm coming from, is that applied behavioral science has been really successful over the last 15 years. There's been a massive growth in the number of teams that apply it, the range of approaches, and so on. And it's demonstrated to have results. But I think with anything that you do in practice, you have to reflect and say that, well, we've done hundreds of these projects now. What are the themes that are coming out? What are we seeing here? And do we need to push ourselves to go further? Because it may be that there is greater opportunity and that we're not actually fulfilling in the way that things have turned out. So it's trying to be both kind of recognizing of success, but also say, there are some challenges that have come up. People have made criticisms of the applied behavioral science approach, and rather than ignoring them, I think we need to look at those and say they may be fair and respond positively. And that's why we have 10 proposals in this manifesto about how we could respond positively and take those opportunities for the future.
Yeah. And those 10 kind of principles that you talk about, I thought were really interesting, as you said, that reflection component that, prior to getting on and recording, we were talking about this and we get so caught up in doing the work that sometimes we don't take time to step back and take that kind of reflective look and kind of see where we want to go and where we have been. So what did you find with those 10 different pieces? What are some of the major themes that are coming out from what you're looking at from that reflection?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, first of all, that this isn't another framework, right? In terms of how to apply it. There have been several of those over the years. I think in a way, it's interesting that isn't a framework because it tries to say, how do we step back and say, rather than another framework of here's how to apply it, it tries to be a bit more reflective, rather than saying we don't have all the answers, but here are some proposals that we can work on as a field. And that's really important because the overall theme is not, here are the technical fixes. It's not like, oh, machine learning is the future of behavioral data science. That's the future. Just go and do it. Or it's not like, oh, we need to fix RCTs so they can deal better with changing variables. Let's go and fix it. Instead, the proposals kind of fall into 3 buckets. One is around like scope. So what have been the ambitions for the field? What have we been applying behavioral science to? And are those the right things? The second bucket is around methods. So, the stuff I just said to you there are some things about how we apply behavioral science that we could improve. Some of those require us to think more about, say, the importance of adaptation to new contexts. Rather than saying that something works, I maybe have been guilty of this myself. We have at the Behavioural Insights Team some frameworks that say, people are influenced by what others do. And you put that statement out there, and that is maybe broadly true. And I think, 8 years ago when we published, say, the East framework, that was the main message we wanted to focus on. But we're not 8 years ago. We are in a place where we know there's a lot more going on in terms of the importance of context, the importance of adaptation. So really then, let's get serious about that. What is the methodological improvement that we need to take that seriously? And so in that methods bucket, there are things like, how we talk about replication, same results in different contexts, how we talk about, say, is just having lists of biases enough? Probably not. So what do you do then? And then finally, third bucket is around values. What are the kind of principles we bring to behavioral science? And that talks about trying to challenge overconfidence, trying to be humble, trying to really explore in depth where people are coming from, trying not to use irrationality as a concept so much, or indeed, I would say at all, because I think the downsides of it in a practical context outweigh the upsides. And then how do we move away from this idea that, behavioral scientists are just kind of observing behavior from some set apart nowhere land, some view from nowhere. Right. We're not. What are the preconceptions we are bringing to this way of seeing? And how can we understand those and account for them and reconcile what we're doing with that reality? So scope, methods, values, it's not just a technical fix. If we want to have a bigger impact to address the big issues in society, we need to grapple with those things as well.
One of the things that I've found really fascinating, especially given my role now at in a bank as a practitioner overseeing behavioral science within an organization of 55,000 employees, I think about scalability. Kurt and I have had the chance to talk to John List about scalability from an economic perspective, but scaling interventions is kind of a big deal in the manifesto. And you noted, and I just want to quote you here, you said the overriding message here is for greater focus on the organizational changes that indirectly apply or support behavioral science principles. Rather than starting with a behavioral science project and then trying to scale it, we could start by looking at operations at scale and understand how they can be influenced. And I really, really love that to flip basically flip the narrative on this. Can you tell us more about this idea of starting by looking at operations at scale and then understanding how they can be influenced?
Yeah, sure. So nothing I'm saying here is easy, but I think...
well, we were hoping for easy.
Oh, man. Actually, some are easier than others. Like I think some recommendations around building in prediction as a standard thing, like before you run an experiment, predict what's going to happen, record it and feedback. That's a fairly self-contained one, which I think could be integrated into standard practice. To return to your question, so I find the scaling arguments and debates a little bit, I don't know what the right word is, frustrating in some ways, but they're a bit limited. So they all assume we have done a discrete project. It has, in some sense, worked, however you evaluate that, and now it needs to go to other places. And I think that is important, and there's no getting away from that. We run projects all the time. Let's think about how they could be used more widely. There are various incentives that act against that, from funders, for example, and just also what gains attention. What gains attention is generally, here's a new result, here's something we want to contribute to our understanding of human behavior. When you get into the realms of, and we did it in 50 cities over 5 years and it was really hard, people respect it, but I would say it doesn't excite them in the same way. If they're practitioners who know how hard it is, it can excite them, but the incentives are not as strong. So the way I was thinking about this is, as you say, flip it on its head. We spend a lot of time talking about how do you set up a nudge unit? How do you set up a behavioral insights team? And that makes sense because we do know things about that process that could be better. But really, I think the bigger question is not how do you set up a dedicated team, but how do you look at an organization and say, here are the behaviors, the processes that are constituting the organization. Let me put that differently. How do you look at an organization and say it has certain processes that affect everyone and they create certain behaviors? Let's look at those processes and say that they are the target of behavioral science knowledge. They are implicit rather than explicit uses of behavioral science. They are how we set budgets, for example. Do we always think about the default? We don't. How do we set up human resources, for example? Do we always do the best we could there? Do we think about what is going on? We don't. There are interesting developments, particularly in public administration, around like behavioural HR, they call it, that try to look at this seriously. But the reason I think it's so important is, well, two reasons. One, it gets at the scale issue. So if you have an organization and you look at the wiring of it, that wiring goes into every room. It constitutes the like the building, right? It flows through. It's not like you start with one room and say, everyone look at this room and you should decorate it like this. It kind of is integral to the organization. And the other reason is because the truth is people may not always ask for behavioral science. Organizational leaders may think, we tried that, or I just don't buy it, or yeah, like it's something that was interesting 4 years ago. But those issues don't go away. And the power of behavioral science in the application doesn't go away just because you don't call it explicitly behavioral science. And so if you can build it into the wiring, then it will endure, even if, to use my very tortured metaphor, you redecorate the room. It'll still be there.
But go ahead, Kurt.
So with that, Michael, I think the really interesting piece is underneath the scope part of this paper, you talk about using behavioral science as a lens, which I think, marries with exactly what you're just saying, that it's not this set of tools. It's not a room. It's a lens to look at the organization. And the more that we can change that metaphor, that it's not a series of biases that we need to understand. It's not a series of nudges that we need to instill, but it is a lens of how to look at organizational behavior. As you said, I hadn't heard of behavioral HR. That to me sounds really fascinating, because now I'm thinking about this as a lens to look at how everybody within the organization is working together. And again, to your scale point that you just were talking about from Tim's question, seems to lend itself into that as well. Would you agree? Am I way off base on my kind of interpretation here?
No, you're not off base. I think what is interesting about behavioral science as a lens. Now, this is an idea that I and others have said for some time. It's of the whole manifesto, the least new part in some ways.
Yeah.
Because we've recognized this as an issue. And the reason it's emerged as an issue is actually, it's almost like come out of the things that made behavioral science strong. And I think this is a really interesting thing, where the approaches that came about, and which you see in various frameworks by us, by other organizations, generally involve identifying a behavior, quite specific, exploring the context, developing some kind of solution, drawing on behavioral science, testing it, and then scaling it. And there were very good reasons why that came about, because at the start of this current phase of applied behavioral science, I know I was there was a lot of skepticism about, will any of this stuff work in practice?
Right.
And it was like, well, we're going to give you some organizational resources. We'll give you a bit of time, but we want to see the results.
Yeah, and oftentimes that involved like a pilot or a small program, right? Not again, it's redecorating the room, right? To some degree, it was how it kind of got started, right?
Yeah, and so if you go in and say, well, there are two ways of thinking about this. You could go in and say, okay, here's a really big policy issue, and here's how you need to completely rethink that. And I'm not saying that hasn't happened. That happens more than people think, partly because it's harder to talk about those examples. And I have a paper which came out recently, which people can read if they're interested, which is a response to this argument about the I frame and S frame, which George Lowenstein and Nick Chater have written. I respect them enormously. I don't at all buy their argument about it, but I kind of said that behavioral science has done more to look at structural issues than people think. I gave some examples. But regardless, they have a point in one sense, which is that the standard approaches I just mentioned tend to focus on specific elements of a policy and environment in order to say, we changed that element. The trade-off is, we didn't change everything, but we changed that one thing, and we can be sure we did it. Because when you're in a room of really skeptical policymakers, economists, the first thing they'll say is, how do you know that this made a difference?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if you say, we ran a randomized control trial where we changed this element, that gives you some credibility. What it also does is over time, people see those presentations, they see the benefits in terms of that strength, and they say, okay, that's what behavioral scientists do.
Yeah.
They change one part of one thing when other things have been decided, generally downstream, generally keeping it nice and neat. And okay, well, if we need that, we'll call on you. Or here's some things we're going to bring to you.
Yeah.
And so the other side of it, the broader potential, tends to be less prominent, and demand is shaped around that very kind of narrow, precise, controlled approach. But that's not everything. And it's got us to this point, but I think there's a danger of diminishing returns in that space.
So can I tap into that? Because you talked about RCTs and using those and how they've been used effectively to demonstrate that, but you also talk in your methods section. And, as you're starting to go, we talked about scope, now getting into methods, and you say, put RCTs in their place. So what do we need to do? I mean, because we still need to show there is the impact at some level. So how do we do that? And what are you talking about when you say put RCTs in their place?
Yes, I'm trying to be a bit provocative in that phrasing, and that's maybe some of the.
I love that myself, but I have my own biases on this, so I'll hold those off for our grooving session. So
it's that's where the manifesto element's coming through a bit in the phrasing. So look, randomized control trials, we have many, many advantages. And we have done a lot of them at BIT. As you know, it's been a core part of our approach with all the advantages I just said. But we haven't really spoken about this yet. But one obvious aspect of the world is that we're dealing with complex environments. I won't go into it now, but there's a whole proposal around understanding how we're dealing with complex adaptive systems. That sounds like I'm just saying things are complicated, but it's not. It's a way of understanding the world that points you towards certain approaches, practical approaches, building in adaptation. And RCTs are part of that. Complex systems are a bit of a challenge to randomized control trials. They're not a fatal challenge, but if in very basic terms, randomized control trials involve some form of group, a control group that is treated differently from other groups. But what if you're in a system where people are interacting all the time, like in a city or in a market? What if those interactions have unexpected effects and can change the nature of the system itself? Well, then it can be harder to keep a control group separate, and it can mean that rather than going from like stable point A to stable point B, that your intervention can change the nature of the whole system. And so, pre-registration is like good practice for randomized control trials. We say, here's what we're going to do. But what if everything changes when you intervene in that system? These are some of the challenges I'm talking about. So I think firstly, what you can do is try to strengthen RCTs to deal better with that complexity, anticipating potential harms. There's this idea of dark logic exercises that try to really force you to look at what could be the harms of your approach, or what could go wrong, rather than a theory of change that's just like, here's what we expect. And that involves engaging people who implement and participate in an intervention. There are options where you can build in feedback and adaptation to the design of randomized trials. So when things change, they can adjust to changing conditions. I won't go into these options here right now, but there are things like evolutionary RCTs, smart trials. You can use machine learning to look at how people are responding and reallocate people to different arms. And also, I think really interesting thing is you can look at alternatives as well. So I think it's really interesting to show and apply behavioral science to agent-based modeling, which is about how you try and simulate the way different actors in the system will interact, which is really important for a complex system. But a lot of those models that exist tend to assume that the actors are operating on rational choice principles. We know that's probably not the case. So behavioral science can add something there so you get a kind of behaviorally informed agent-based modeling. Lots of technical terms here, but that then is a real fusion between thinking about complex systems, thinking about evidence about behavior, and evaluating what is likely to happen in the real world rather than a kind of static world of a randomized trial protocol.
Yeah. One of the things that you talk about, and by the way, I love this idea of, I'm going back to like getting into the wiring, the building itself, not just the room. And I guess that's because kind of where I'm at work-wise and career-wise, I just really resonate with that idea. You talk about choice infrastructure. We're all pretty familiar with the idea of choice architecture. But you talk about choice infrastructure. And I was wondering if you could, in the manifesto, I was wondering if you could spend just a minute sort of explaining that, because I think that that's it's a cool concept to start to get out there.
Absolutely. So the first thing is, it's not my concept.
Okay.
It's not my terminology. It was created. The framing of it is from Ruth Schmidt and Kathleen Stenger, who I'm a big fan of their work, and they have some really great papers, which I encourage people to look at. I think they're very thoughtful in terms of thinking about ideas like choice infrastructure, behavioral brittleness. They have these really kind of interesting ideas. But basically what they say with choice infrastructure is kind of what we were talking about. So there has been a lot of focus on choice architecture, but I think choice architecture points you towards, if you like, discrete, like in this metaphor, buildings or things that are almost standalone. But obviously there are connections between those buildings. There's the plumbing, the sewers that go between buildings. And so those connections and that infrastructure really affects the discrete units in ways that maybe choice architecture doesn't think enough about. If you just take a set of choices, you're cutting a lot out. So when they talk about choice infrastructure, they mean, like the wiring, the conditions in an organization that, or a wider system that shape what kind of architecture you can even have, for example. Whereas if you just walk up to the building, you may think, well, it had to be this way in some ways. You don't think about that stuff. But then if you're an engineer, you're thinking about, here are the possibilities. This constrains what we can build here. And so it's just that broadening out, really, which is kind of, choice architecture. It's true. The metaphor encourages you to think about a discrete set of things. Now, I think the challenge is, where do you stop, right? What are the ways of thinking that make this kind of tractable, and it's not just like, oh, everything is connected to everything else? And there are ways of doing that. So I'm not saying just go completely and say, well, everything's connected to everything else and it's all very hard to work it out. But I think it's a metaphor as well. When you're looking at that, saying, yeah, we talk about choice architecture, but let's also think about the infrastructure here that shaped that architecture.
Very cool.
Yeah, I love all of these, how they're tying in together. It goes back to what we started at the beginning of saying, we put our heads down, we start doing the work, we have successes within those pieces that we're working on, but it's taking that larger perspective, that larger view, and trying to elevate everybody up to say, where can we go from this? And I think going back to this aspect of being a manifesto, the last section that you talk about in values, I think is one that, as a practicing behavioral scientist in the work that I do, Tim, I'm believing the same thing for you, is that these values is part of what we talk about all the time, the ethics of this, but I think it goes beyond that in kind of thinking even bigger than just the ethical implications of this intervention or that intervention, is like thinking about how do we have to approach the discipline and the work that we're doing from a large scale, and what are those values we have. So would love for you to talk a little bit about when you think of values and kind of as that manifesto of saying, look, we're doing some good things, but we need to do better. And I think that's what that's what I read into a lot of what you wrote here.
Yeah, I can give you some examples of what I mean here. So I think the first one, which we talk about under this label of be humble, explore, and enable, I do think there is a tendency towards overconfidence. There has been. And that is, overconfidence happens in many different areas, but I think there are a couple of things that can make behavioral science vulnerable to this in particular. And I think one can be to rely on these kind of, often phrased as biases or heuristics, but rely on these kind of decontextualized principles and then apply them to a real world setting without thinking enough about what is actually going on here. I'm not saying everyone does this, but I think it is a real potential issue. So if you have these ideas around, say, I don't know, like optimism bias or the fundamental attribution error, you'll be familiar with many of them over the course of your episodes. Well, if you have those to hand, unless you spend enough time thinking about and looking at what's going on in the context, there's a danger to kind of pattern recognition and saying, oh, well, look, that's present bias, or, we spotted it, and that's the cause of this behavior. And here are harms that are arising from that bias. Now, I'm not saying everyone does this at all. And I think it's true that a lot of the better practice in behavioral science doesn't do this. But in the manifesto, I point out some instances where in our own work as the Behavioural Insights team, we went a bit deeper, and we thought initially we understood what was going on. And then later we found out that actually there are good reasons why people are behaving in a particular way. It's not a bias. There's an aspect of the wider context that is explaining what's going on here. And I think this is a critique that's that's been around for a while of behavioral science. So it's not new, but I think it's worth, taking it seriously. So, and looking at that, worth taking it seriously and worth thinking, what do we do? So I think this is where I think the word irrationality is actually not helping us. And you'll see big variation between how much people use this word. Some people, name their whole approach or organization after that word or their book. And some people don't really use it in the way they're thinking, because they think about, at the other extreme is someone like Gerd Gigerenzer, for example, who's saying this is all evolutionary, adaptive, and sometimes maladaptive, but really think about how it matches context. And so I think that is a fair point. To be clear, applied behavioral science is a broad range of things. It's never been the case that it's just like nudges and we focus on biases alone. Over the years, people have been thinking about, okay, well, the Gerd Gigerenzer approach, boosting and so on. That's been part of it. But I think there's this underlying issue that you can get with overconfidence that's kind of sometimes baked into the method. So I think we need to limit the use of irrationality, really understand that if we're making a kind of conclusion about behavior, it has to be provisional and incomplete, and something that, this is where the idea of testing helps, but it really is a hypothesis. And I think, going into more detail about people's goals and strategies, their own interpretations of their beliefs, feelings, and behaviors. I think, if I'm honest with you, certainly in the earlier days, there was a bit of a reaction to research that was like, let's do a focus group and see what people say about the behavior, and then say that's the truth and the real understanding. Look at a focus group and say what people say is the cause of their behavior is actually the cause. Now, I'm not saying that you then have to go back the other way, but I think there has not been enough attention to people's goals and strategies and their interpretations of their beliefs, feelings, and behaviors. And that can matter because otherwise you don't fully understand the context. Again, I'm not saying this happens all the time, but I think it's part of, it's like saying that aspect of our practice, when we get it right, we should build on that. When we are at our worst, maybe, and say, oh, this is present bias and here's the solution, let's do less of that.
When you talk about irrationality, and you've been campaigning sort of against emphasizing the word irrationality for some time, and what would be a better way to frame it? Because I think that it probably comes from the roots of behavioral sciences, sort of going back to behavioral economics and the economic model of being rational versus not rational. So there's sort of a roots problem there. But what would you replace it with, or how might we change our framing or thinking about that model, Michael?
Yes. So I want to be clear that I'm not saying that there is no such thing as rationality, that you couldn't define it. And I think you're right. It's partly because of the roots in behavioral, in economics, right? I think it's more like a practical thing, that the use of it in practice is often unhelpful, I think, because it encourages that kind of overconfident approach that I just mentioned. And I think it almost stops you thinking about a broader future where the use of behavioral science is decentered. People are using it to achieve their own goals. And I don't mean I'm aware of the boosts and the approach around boosting, self-nudging and so on. I say elsewhere in the manifesto that actually we're thinking about all these things in the wrong way, and we should be thinking about how much people are involved in shaping their intervention, even if it doesn't boost their capability. So it's like there is a very simplistic argument that is put out there that nudges are disempowering and paternalistic, and boosts and the various different things like nudge plus are empowering, and they're much, much better. And actually I think you can be paternalistic if you go and say, what you really need to do is improve your capabilities and learn this new approach. I think that can be paternalistic.
And okay.
Whereas
and okay, right? Yeah. It's a good thing.
Well, I mean, what I'm saying is more complicated than just saying, oh, we should move away from this, like the nudges are bad and boosts are good. Like, what do people want here? How much have they been involved in making that choice, whether they want a nudge or a boost? There are learning costs involved for like a boost, right? Like people have to say that they may not have those capabilities right now, may not want to learn right now. All I'm saying is more complicated, but I think there is a broader future for behavioral science, which is more decentered, away from a model of there is a choice architect who identifies, biases or whatever, and changes things that leads to a certain outcome. And I think there are many different ways that can go. They link back to the idea of complex systems as well, and the way change can emerge. They go beyond the idea of boosts, which are kind of very individually focused and so on. There's a future there. But I think irrationality can bake in a more disempowering idea of behavioral science. I think I agree with that critique over time. People have made it before. I think it's got legs. So, but the response is not like, oh, let's not do any behavioral science, which like sometimes the idea of it, like you were too quick to say someone's being irrational, therefore you should just walk away and do nothing. No, there's a positive thing here as well about understanding behavior and context, thinking about the way people use information. And there are many ways you can think about this in terms of like, I won't go into too much detail, but there are approaches like resource rationality, which is like people are making the best use of their available resources in making decisions. So if people are coming up with an answer that is wrong in some ways, maybe they decided it's not worth getting that answer right. And they've had a broader look at how they want to do things in their life. So it's not just like an unstructured way of saying, oh, just walk away. You can take a new approach as well. There's a positive agenda here.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting aspect of, as you talked about this is a complex component and there's a variety of different pieces, but it's not a throw everything out because this isn't there have these negative elements to it. It's like, no, we have to look at this from a different perspective and try to understand where can we and how can we best apply some of these things so that it improves everybody's performance, life elements, as opposed to being that top-down, this is the way that we're going to do it element as we're thinking about this. This values section was the part for me that I thought was really interesting. And I don't think we have enough time to really get into it, but there's this element about data and equity that I think, given the power of machine learning and AI as it's coming on and all of the factors of the technology that is coming into play, what is our role as behavioral scientists to make sure that when we are applying this, and I loved you talked about personalization of services and how there's an element of people that, that's very scary. And I can tell you that is one of the things that's been, Tim and I have talked about this, that scares me. But I think you laid out some nice pieces of that. And I know we have just a couple minutes left, but could you kind of talk about that a little bit? Because I think that was something that struck home with me.
Yeah, sure. So where I was coming from here is you see a lot of discussion around the power of machine learning and personalization, data science more generally. And unfortunately, it's presented almost like, well, of course, we can just do this. And this is the obvious future. So it's like technically one criticism of behavioral science has been it's like imprecise. If you take the nudge paradigm, and I should say that nudges can do so much stuff. And sometimes when you're dealing with policy at a high level with not very good data, then shifting a whole population's behavior, maybe that's the wrong term, enabling a change in behavior at scale, at margins, is the best thing you can do. But one of the criticisms has been it's very broad brush. It's quite crude. You're not really being very precise. You could do more. I think that is right. But again, we tend to have these discussions in quite technical way without thinking about these really big looming ethical debates. And so I just wanted to say that, let's think about this. So will people know what data has been used to target them and how? If you have very specific data about people, could that be used to exploit, vulnerabilities? Do people, particularly in the public sector, expect some form of universality, some form of non-discrimination, if you like? What kind of characteristics is it okay to target on? I think this is very difficult territory. I think, there is the danger as well of algorithmic bias. People have talked about that you could use some of these approaches, which I think could be really powerful, to exploit rather than help people, particularly vulnerable people. And it may be that disadvantaged groups are more likely to be subject to the decisions of algorithms, and therefore inequalities being perpetuated. And then also finally, you look at some of the data. What do people want? Like if you ask them, sometimes they say they want some personalized services. They don't like customized advertising, particularly based on sensitive information. And they don't like that information being collected. I know there's something of a paradox here. Sometimes people want some of the outcomes, but not some of the collection of the data. But we're really in the foothills of asking people what they want. I was looking, there really isn't that much data. Yet on the other side of it, there's lots and lots of attention on how would you do it?
Yeah,
technically,
right.
So in very brief, we don't have a complete answer here, but I think if we know that there's a lot of variance in behavior, and algorithms and machine learning can be used to identify those differences in situations and responses, then the fundamental principle is those techniques should be used to support and ideally reduce the kind of inequities that exist that you've identified, rather than exploiting them and making them worse. Because you could use it to say, well, here are people we can make like a quick buck on. That is the nightmare, I think, or that's the ethically very challenging route that I would say we shouldn't go down. We shouldn't go down as a field, right? But unless you recognize that danger, then you won't know the warning signs until you zoom past them.
Yeah, this is always the case, right? We're always stuck with this idea that the lens, the behavioral science lens, and the resulting interventions can be very powerful, and they can be used for evil just as much as they can be used for good. So, that's an ongoing problem.
Yeah, Michael, as always, this has been fantastic conversation. We could go on and talk about.
We could go on.
all of these pieces, right? But but we will encourage our listeners, go out, read this article, and we'll have links to it in obviously the show notes and various different pieces of it. But as always, thank you. So appreciative of not just the conversation here, but just your thinking in this field. I mean, the way that pushes the envelope, I think, is really positive. It is that we need to take a step back. We just can't put our heads down and just keep moving forward. We need to stop, pause, and reflect. And now from that reflection, we can make a better decision on how we need to move forward as a field, as a discipline, and as just practitioners ourselves. So thank you for that.
Well, thanks so much. I mean, the article should be out in Nature Human Behavior when people are listening to this. There is a longer version which will be available from bi.team, the Behavioural Insights website. Encourage people to dive in. I could have written 50 blogs, but instead we put it all together to try and make one cohesive thing. So I really would urge people to get into some depth here, because we tried to make some practical recommendations as well. We've barely scratched the surface today, but it's been, as always, fantastic talking to you both.
Well, to that point, I would encourage people that this is a discussion that we all need to have. Yeah. And so, as much as we can in the different avenues that we have here, these are discussions that we should all be having with each other to figure out the impact, what does this imply for how I show up every single day? Those are going to be important conversations to have. So, we need to go out, read this, let's start conversations, and let's make our world a better place, using behavioral science in a right, ethical, manifesto way. There you go.
So before we get deep into grooving, I just want to say that we've been at this for more than 300 episodes for listeners in more than 170 countries. And by the way, that's including the bots in Russia and China. Yep. And we do it for the love of the discipline.
Yeah, so that means we're going for fame and not fortune, right, Tim?
Well, basically, yes. We really appreciate you sharing this episode with a friend. Leave us a rating on your podcast listening app, or if you're super adventurous, a quick review that shares a couple of your thoughts that you have about behavioral grooves. And just sharing that with the world would be so appreciated. We would be grateful.
We would, and again, we would be very appreciative of your support as we close in on 350 episodes, Mr. Houlihan. 350 episodes. Do you believe that? That is crazy.
It kind of blows my mind. And it's really an amazing number to come up on, to think that we've been doing this, for almost 6 years. And we just want to thank you.
And we want to thank everybody. And yes, we are in it for the fame and not the fortune. But if you want to help with just supporting this so that it doesn't make us poorer, you can go out to our Patreon site and help us there. Yeah. You can hire Tim and myself to come and bring some behavioral science insights into your world, your organization. We are cheap. We'll do it. We'll do it cheap. We're cheap dates.
We're not inexpensive, but we can be cheap. Oh no! I think it's supposed to be the other way around. We're not.
I think it's the other way around. I think we can be inexpensive, but we're not cheap.
Yeah,
there you go.
So mess that one up. Yeah. Okay, but whatever we are grateful, and anything that you would like to do to contribute emotionally, morally, financially, whatever it is, we would appreciate it. So back to you, Kurt.
All right. So Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I share ideas on what we learned from our discussion with Michael, have a free-flowing conversation, and talk about whatever else comes into our future changing brains. You thought I was going to say manifesto.
I did. I would have bet money on manifesto brains.
I knew that. I should have bet because I could have won some money. You go. But no, I was just thinking, I mean, really, the manifesto that Michael's talking about is really just it's kind of a proposal for moving into the future. So our brains are thinking about what the future entails and holds for this field that we so love and hold dear to us. And I don't know, that's where I was going with it. So,
and I think that's a great thing to be focused on. And I'm really grateful that Michael, as kind of a big thinker guy, is thinking about the future of behavioral science, right? We need that, right? We need someone to, so I'm just grateful for his role in doing this and saying, I'm holding up the stop card and saying, let's just take a pause and make sure that the future of behavioral science is on track.
I love that you bring up this idea about Michael being a deep thinker, because his thought processes around this and other things that we've had conversations with him with, or things that he's written. I mean, the whole response to the nudge kind of detail that he wrote out, it's just that he thinks about things from a different perspective. And I think it's really beneficial for everybody who is interested in this field, because it just drives our thinking in new ways, down new paths. It takes us down rabbit holes that we might not be even seeing. And so by doing that, I think it just adds to the power that we bring, the likelihood that this field is going to be elevated and not sink. So
and when you say different thinking, you're talking about different thinking than the rest of us mere mortals in the world, because he really does have a very elevated thought process. But let's talk about what the first thing that I wanted to bring up was this idea that why he wrote the manifesto, why he put this together. And I thought that this was really important, that he wanted to document, right? He wanted to the future of behavioral science in a way that was impacted by his reflections, right? He started with this idea of he felt a need to reflect on where we've been, like take an accounting, and I think that that's a really important thing. Like before, like at the end of every year, what do? We reflect on where we'd been before we develop our strategies for the next year. And I felt like that was really good. And the second thing that I thought was really cool is that he felt a need to push ourselves in the discipline so that we don't get lulled into thinking that our current approaches are always best. That I feel like if status quo bias is going to impact us, let's do what we can now. Let's do a pre-mortem and get ahead of it and say, let's not go there. Let's avoid status quo bias. Let's avoid the defaults of this is where we've been. Those were a couple of things that I just thought that were really important in the way that he set it up.
I think they are important. What was interesting to me is, when he reached out and we were talking with him and he sent us this manifesto, before I started reading it, my big question is, and kind of almost, I don't know if it still is or not, but is there a need for a manifesto? Are we at an inflection point in the field where we need to address this? And I think that's a question that I would love to get our listeners. Anybody who's still listening to this obviously is interested in the field of either applied or research around behavioral science, and would love their thoughts on this. And part of this, I think, comes down to, again, probably as we talked about at the beginning, the bias that I have about the word manifesto and the prescriptive nature of this. Are these the 10 key pieces that are going to drive the field forward? Are they the right responses in there? And I think it's a really fascinating. I think Michael brings up some really good points, and I think there is some really deep thought into this, as we talked about. But I'm still just I'm wavering. And I think Michael has convinced me more towards the need that it is there than against it.
Yeah. I would also say that when I go through the themes in the manifesto, and there are 10 themes that broken down under scope, methods, and values, and we talked a little bit about these in the podcast, but the way Michael breaks them down never felt rigid or prescriptive to me.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated that. And however, there were times when I was looking for a little more North Star in it. There were times when I was hoping for something that was a little bit more aspirational out there, to say we could navigate the success of the development of the field of behavioral science if we use this North Star to navigate by, if we had this out there.
Yeah, and I think that's hard though, and what I appreciate
yeah,
about,
damn hard.
I mean, no, seriously, and we've talked about this, right? But again, one of the themes that comes up throughout this entire interview that we had with Michael, as well as the paper, and I implore everybody out there, if you have not read the paper, go out, read the paper. If you're in the field, if you are applying behavioral science in any form or manner, researching it, go out and read it, because it raises some really good questions and provides some pretty good insights into, some solutions to what some of these kind of issues
and
that
it's
we
a quick
are
read.
running into.
Yeah, it is
a quick read.
Yeah.
But I think there is this aspect that, as much as I would like a North Star, that's hard because context matters and all these other things. And so it's kind of hard to do. And so Michael's solution, I think, is kind of looking at, getting down into the weeds in some cases about how do we do, randomized control trials in the field, actually being in business, in applying this, right? And this is mostly about applied, although you can take some of this from a research perspective. So I think there is real value in this work. And I'd just be very interested to hear what our listeners think as well, because I think the bigger piece, and we should have asked Michael this, and I apologize, Michael, if you're listening to this afterwards, we should have asked you this, but is the intent of this to build a conversation within the community, to say, hey, here's my stake in the ground, and where do people fall on this, or where that is. And that's my take. And I think that's going to be some of the value that comes from this.
I felt the same way. The manifesto to me feels a lot like a conversation starter. It's not the end of the conversation. It's the beginning of the conversation. It's to kind of nudge us. And I'm not using nudge in a classical behavioral science way. I'm using it like gently.
You're actually pushing us.
Just actually gently pushing us forward to say, let's make sure that we cover these 10 themes as we're continuing to build out the field. And that felt really good, that he at no point in time to say this is the solution. Again, it's not,
that's very true.
It's not prescriptive, but it's really good for thinking about this as a discussion guide. And as we start to talk about these things, and this is kind of central to what science is, right? We have discussions about things, we talk about them, and the good ideas hopefully will prevail. In the late 18th century, Newtonian physics was the best thing going, and it had revolutionized the way we think about the world. But that's changed.
But it's still it's changed, but it's still useful.
Yeah,
that's the
true.
Interesting piece, right? I mean, if you want to plot, the direction of a missile, right? You're not using Einstein's, theorem. You're using Newtonian physics to do that, right? Within the area. And I think that is...
you would. I might do something different, but...
Oh my God. Okay. So, but within there, and So here, I wanted to touch a little bit because you brought this up, this idea of scope, methods, values, right? And under scope, one of the things that I think is really interesting, and we've had this conversation prior, is this idea of behavioral science as a lens, not just a tool bag of biases, right?
Yep.
And that to me resonates. That is a big piece of what I think we need to get away from this idea that it's this list of 322 biases, and heuristics. And it's a lens of looking, particularly as we think about business. And I had just had a conversation with our old friend, Charlotte Blank, who used to be CBO at Merritt's. And, it was one of the things that we talked about because she moved into a different role where she's no longer, kind of a CBO, she's chief marketing officer now. And so within that role, I was asking her, are you using behavioral science? And she said to a certain degree, but not as much as I would like. And again, it's that lens. And so how do we integrate that lens into organizations at a deeper level, in a more broad level across the organization, and not just with people like you, who are, leading that role within a company.
Which gets me to one of the things that I liked in methods, and that was about RCTs within organizations. Like bring the random control trials into the field, into organizations. Let's, do them properly, right? Let's do them right.
But this is where okay, so maybe I had a different interpretation of this, because what I read about this is put RCTs in their place. This idea that sometimes in organization, you can't do an RCT,
right,
nor will the organization let you.
Yep.
And that's okay.
Yes.
We don't need to get it, particularly at an organizational level. I don't need to necessarily understand the mechanism of action that is actually driving the change. I just want to see that the change itself is happening. And so, and maybe I just totally misunderstood that, which probably is true.
No,
that's what I'm doing. But that's the piece where I was excited, because I'm going, too many times I think we get stuck in this research mode as opposed to an application mode. And the research mode is, I have to very clearly define all of these and make sure that I have the right R values and that the significance is there, and all of these, make sure there's no confounding factors. And in business, and we've had these conversations in the past, it isn't always that. It is about, are we getting the results that we need? And yes, I want to understand why, but that isn't the be all. The end is about the results. It's not about the methods or the means to get there.
Agreed, 100%. And there will be times when we do want to understand why.
Yes, I'm not. Good point.
And in those situations, I felt like Michael was saying, let's do it, and let's do it right. Let's not sort of hold back when we need to do an RCT in the field. Let's do it and do it properly. Let's,
Well, and looking at different ways of getting the same type of information, the different type of statistical processing, the different testing methods to do that. And he brought up stuff that is well beyond my mere mortal brain and thinking about how those are. And in the paper, he writes about those as well. Yeah. So what about values, Tim? What did you?
Well, I love that he starts that whole discussion about values with humility, and I love that because I think that's really,
because you need that in your life, because you're just not humble enough.
I need it. I need to be reminded constantly about how, if I weren't so great, what else would I be doing? God, as if. No, this humility, again, wherever the field is being practiced, it's too easy. And he just put his finger right on it for us to go, oh, that's confirmation bias. Oh, that's, it's like whack-a-mole, oh, I can get that one. I can name that bias in 2 words. Like, let's stop that. Let's actually think about what are the problems that we're trying to solve, and what is it that we need to do to solve them, and not just be so happy that we named it the right way. So I like that, and I was particularly fond of that part of the discussion. How about you, Kurt? What about values structure?
Well, I think that I want to just double down on what you just said there. So I went to the Minnesota History Museum last night, and they have a Sherlock Holmes exhibit there.
Oh,
and
because Sherlock Holmes was from Minnesota, wasn't he? Is that the connection?
Sherlock Holmes? Are you talking the same? Arthur Conan Doyle?
No, that must have been his cousin Bob Holmes.
Bob Holmes. No, but he totally just disrupted my train of thought,
sorry.
man. I can't concentrate now. But anyway, no, in part of that, it was really interesting because they have you run through a crime scene and you have to do this. And one of the things that they said at the very beginning is look at the evidence and not assumptions. You will be inclined to make assumptions about what happened,
Right.
But what a good detective does is looks at the evidence and lets the evidence tell them what happened, as opposed to making an assumption about what happened and then trying to fill in with the evidence. And I think this is the part about the humble that I take from Michael, is that too often we come in because we have a grounding of knowledge and we go, oh, that must be, as you said, confirmation bias. Therefore, this is it. And we no longer take that time to maybe pause and to look at what the evidence is pointing to and say, oh, maybe confirmation bias is part of this, but what else is going on here? And what are the other factors? And to have that. So I think that is a big piece of this. And then lastly, and we've had this conversation too, let's just bury the word irrational. And let's just get that. I mean, we can use it in appropriate times, but everything that doesn't fall within a classical economist's, normalized perspective of the world doesn't mean that it's irrational, that there is probably an actual good reason for it. And we need to understand that. And I think it just doesn't drive well and doesn't suit the modern world.
I couldn't agree more. That sounds great to me.
Well, Groovers, I think that's going to wrap this episode of Behavioral Grooves. We hope that you've enjoyed our conversation, rant, whatever you want to call it, our manifesto of ourselves, and the grooving session that we had on Michael Hallsworth's manifesto, and that you've taken an idea or two, and hopefully you can apply it in the work that you do or into your own life.
Yeah, and if you enjoyed the conversation, drop us a line, leave us a review, give us a quick rating. Just to remind you, we don't do behavioral grooves for fortune. We do it for fame.
And we do want to start a conversation about this, right? Because I think that is the big piece that I would like to see as a takeaway from this, is to get people to think about this, because that's the one piece that I think Michael probably doesn't even realize himself, is that the power that he has of bringing these thoughts, these ideas, these questions forward, can really make a difference across many, many organizations. So, maybe we should revisit our goals around, what we do with this show, if it's only just for the fame and not for the fortune.
Well, maybe we should. But for the time being, folks, we hope that you just take a little bit of behavioral insight, ask yourself the questions, talk about this with your friends, family, loved ones, coworkers,
strangers.
Talk about it.
On the bus, on the train, on the plane.
Do it. And that maybe you could use this to help you go out this week and find your groove.